That evening, when Craig called me useless in front of everyone, I was sitting at the table I had built myself, in the house I had raised with my own hands, brick by brick, over 5 years. He stood at the far end with the certainty of someone who believes he has the right to say whatever he thinks. "You don't contribute anything," he said. "You live off us. You're a burden." I said nothing. I set down my cutlery, folded my napkin, and stood up slowly. 48 hours later, Mr. Pemberton rang the doorbell, and everything Craig had imagined began to fall apart. To understand this story, you need to know what this house really is. Not a building, not an address in a register. It is the only thing on this earth I created from nothing, with money saved over years, with weekends spent laying foundations while others rested, with plans that Dorothy and I spread across the kitchen table and sometimes stained with red wine. It is the house where my son learned to walk, the house where Dorothy died. Anyone who tells me I live here through their generosity has never built anything in his life truly worth keeping. Before I go on, if you're watching this for the first time, subscribe to the channel and write to me in the comments from which country or city you're watching right now. It moves me every time to see how far these stories travel. Some write from places I have never visited, and yet understand exactly what I mean, word for word. That is why I tell them. And now back to Arthur Whitfield, that is me, and the story that began because I was too generous and did not see early enough what was growing inside my own home. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, a widower for 6 years. Dorothy died on a Friday evening in November, quietly, without drama, as she had done everything in her life. After that, I lived alone in this house for 3 years, and I will not pretend it was easy. It was hard. Not because of the silence I knew well. It was hard because every corner carried something of hers. The kitchen tiles she chose at a market, the oak bookshelf I built for her books, the apple tree we planted together, bearing fruit every autumn as if she had left precise instructions. When Craig asked if he and Julie could move in temporarily, I said yes without hesitating. Craig had just sunk his only business and they needed time, stability, solid ground under their feet. I thought, this is my son, this is my family. What else was I supposed to do? I cleared the guest room, bought new bedding, and cooked Craig's favorite meal that first evening. I still remember how he thanked me that night, how he said I was a good father. Those words sound different in my memory today, as though he already knew what he had planned to do. The first sign came at 3 weeks. I returned from the garden and the sitting room looked different. The sofa was no longer where Dorothy had placed it, in the same spot for 20 years, never moved an inch. Craig had reorganized everything. When I asked why, he said it flowed better now. He was smiling as he said it. I looked at the room that no longer seemed mine and said nothing. I told myself it was a small thing. People settle in, need their own space. I did not yet understand this was not carelessness. It was the first gesture of a long and calculated takeover. 4 months later, my workshop had disappeared. Not exactly disappeared. My tools were in boxes in the garage, neatly packed, as though someone had organized a quiet funeral. Craig had converted the room into an office. New desk, second screen, a sign on the door that said study. He told me only after everything was already installed and in place. I stood before my boxed saws and planes and tried to be fair. He works from home, I told myself. He needs the space. But something in me registered clearly. He no longer asks. He informs afterwards, or says nothing at all. At a family dinner, he cut across me 3 times in the same conversation. Not in passing. He did it deliberately, with the tone of someone establishing a hierarchy before witnesses. The guests noticed. I saw it in their looks. That brief discomfort people feel when they witness a humiliation and do not know whether to intervene or keep staring at their plate. I let him speak. I kept eating. But that evening I began to see things I had ignored or chosen not to see. Craig was no longer behaving like a guest. He was behaving like an heir who had already taken possession. Then he took control of the household finances. He explained it as a practical arrangement. He was earning well again. He would cover the running costs. I had nothing to worry about. It sounded like consideration, and at first I took it that way. But gradually I understood what it really meant. He had installed himself as functional head of the household. Bills went to his name. Tradesmen called him, not me. The neighbor knocked at his door when he needed something. I had become a walk-on part in my own home, politely tolerated, excluded from decisions, slowly written out of my own daily life. The garden fence was replaced one morning without my knowing. A tree felled, the apple tree Dorothy had planted. A room repainted in a cold gray she would never have chosen. Each time I found out afterwards. Each time there was a reasonable explanation. And each time I felt something tighten inside me. Not anger, but something colder and clearer. The awareness that I was no longer the true inhabitant of this place. That I had become, in my son's eyes, a piece of furniture. Something around which plans are made and changes carried out, without ever asking it anything. I heard him one Tuesday evening on the phone in the garden. I was in the kitchen, the window ajar. He was speaking quietly, but the evening was perfectly still. I understood most of what he said, and then I heard the sentence that changed everything. Once the old man signs, it all goes into my name. He was talking about my house. He had a timeline. He had someone he was planning this with. I remained motionless behind the kitchen door for several minutes. Then I put down the tea towel, dried my hands, and went upstairs. I sat beside Dorothy's photograph and stayed there until well past midnight. The next morning I called Mr. Pemberton, not to complain, not to seek advice. I already knew what I wanted. I only needed to know whether the law gave me what I needed to act. Pemberton has managed my affairs for 30 years. He knows every detail of my financial situation. When I told him what I had heard and what I intended to do, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said calmly, "Arthur, the house is yours. It always has been. Let us talk carefully." I noted the appointment, put down the phone, and ate breakfast in peace for the first time in weeks. Perhaps some of you are wondering why I did not react sooner. The honest answer is this: because Craig is my son, my only son. I thought that if I had patience, if I gave space, he would eventually understand where he stood and what he owed. I was wrong. There are people to whom you give space and they fill it with gratitude. And there are people to whom you give space and they mark it immediately as their own territory. Craig was the second kind. It took me longer than it should have to accept that, but I accepted it in time, and that was what mattered. Mr. Pemberton confirmed what I had hoped. The title deed had been registered exclusively in my name since the build, without any ambiguity. No shared obligations, no usage agreements, no recognized rights for Craig or Julie. They were living here as gratuitous occupiers, a legal concept with a very precise meaning in property law. He explained the requirements for the notice, the legal timelines, and the grounds for accelerated proceedings. I listened as I had in the technical briefings of my working years, calm, precise, without visible emotion. I asked him to prepare a draft, not to send it yet, just to have it ready. I also contacted an old acquaintance, a retired judge I had known from my professional years. Without mentioning names, I described the situation to him. He confirmed Mr. Pemberton's assessment and added something I had not anticipated. If Craig was using my property address in planning applications without my express written authorization, that could constitute unlawful assumption of property rights, a legally valid trigger for the accelerated procedure. I thanked him, went home, and waited. I did not have to wait long. Craig was an impatient man, and impatient men who believe they have already won make decisive mistakes. The confirmation came 4 weeks later by post. Craig had submitted a planning application to the council for an extension to the terrace, with my property address registered in his name as applicant and rights holder. My property, my address, without my name, without my signature, without my knowledge or consent of any kind. I placed the letter carefully on my desk. I called Mr. Pemberton and said only, "It is time." He knew immediately what that meant. We had been preparing the envelope for weeks and waiting for this precise moment. Craig had himself pulled the trigger with a form he considered a harmless formality. In the meantime, Craig had already celebrated his imaginary victory. He had invited several couples to dinner. Long table, good bottles, the air of a confident host. He had shown them through the house as though it were his personal gallery. He spoke about the planned extension, renovations he had in mind, the future of this property. I sat at the table eating and listening. At one point he pointed at me with a smile and said I was the furniture they had inherited with the house. The guests laughed. I raised my glass. I said nothing. I thought only of the sealed envelope in Mr. Pemberton's office. 2 days after that dinner, Mr. Pemberton appeared personally at the door. It was a Tuesday morning. Craig was at work. The children were at school. Julie opened the door. I was not there. I was at the cemetery placing fresh flowers on Dorothy's grave, as I do every second Tuesday without exception. Pemberton handed Julie the sealed envelope, introduced himself calmly, and asked her to read the contents at her own pace. Julie called me 40 minutes later. I did not answer. I laid the flowers on Dorothy's grave and drove home slowly, very slowly, taking my time. The envelope contained the formal notice to vacate the property, based on the unauthorized use of my property address in a planning application submitted to the council without my knowledge or consent. The required departure, 48 hours, supported by the provision for accelerated proceedings for unlawful assumption of another's property without title. With it were Mr. Pemberton's full legal opinion, the notarially certified copy of the title deed, and a letter I had written by hand for Julie. No attack, no list of accumulated grievances, just one sentence, the only one I owed her. I still love you, but this house is mine. Craig called me. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring again. At the third attempt I answered and said only, "Speak to Mr. Pemberton." Then I hung up. He called a solicitor friend who reviewed the documents in an hour. The solicitor called Craig back. What exactly was said I do not know firsthand, but Julie told me afterwards in a steady voice. He said there was absolutely nothing to be done. The documentation was entirely solid and legally unassailable. Craig spent the night looking for a loophole. He found none. He had lost a house he had never truly owned. Julie wrote to me that night with 6 messages, one after another. I read them all. She asked if I was certain about what I was doing. She asked if we could not talk before it was too late. She wrote that the children were confused and frightened. I replied the next morning, briefly and without coldness. The children are always welcome. So are you. Craig decides alone whether he ever finds his way back. I sent the message, took my coffee, and looked through the window at the garden. The apple tree was there. It was one of those autumn mornings when the light falls a certain way. They left within 36 hours. I was not home while they packed. I had left Julie the spare key and gone to see an old friend who lives nearby. When I returned, the house was empty of them, but full of what they had left. A few forgotten boxes in the hallway, a child's jacket on the coat rack, a jar of jam in the fridge. I set the jacket aside for the next time with the grandchildren. The rest I left where it was. I walked through every room slowly, one after another, like someone rereading an old and important book from the very beginning. The first thing I did was return my tools to the workshop. Every saw, every plane, every hammer, I put them back in their place, as I had done for 20 years. Then I carried the desk out of the room and left it on the pavement for collection. After that, I pushed the sitting room sofa back to where Dorothy had always wanted it, the very spot Craig had moved it from one morning without asking anyone. I know that is sentimental. I know a piece of furniture does not bring anyone back. But when I pushed the sofa to its place, the house breathed differently. 3 weeks later, the grandchildren came. I had arranged it through Julie's sister, the only one in the family who had known from the beginning what I was planning, and the only one who had never hesitated to tell me, "You are right, Arthur, and you must do it." The children arrived from school with their rucksacks and noisy steps, and I opened the door and held each one separately, without saying a single word about what had happened. We made pancakes together. The eldest asked where the new desk in the room had gone. I told him calmly it had never belonged there. He shrugged and kept eating. Julie and I spoke properly for the first time 2 months later. She called on a quiet Sunday morning without Craig in the background. She was not crying. She said only, "I know I should have stepped in much sooner." I replied, "Yes," not cruelly, simply honestly. It was the most sincere exchange we had had in years, perhaps longer. I invited her to lunch and she came. We sat at the table I had built myself, ate together, talked about Dorothy, about the children, sometimes about nothing in particular. It was the beginning of something. Still small, still fragile, but real. With Craig I have not spoken since, and I do not expect to. This is not bitterness. I carry nothing of him that weighs on me. But there are things that were said that should not have been said. "You're useless. You don't contribute anything. You live off us." That is what he said to me, in my house, at my table, in front of my family. Those words no longer have a shared future between us, and I am completely at peace with that. Without meaning to, he gave me the clearest thing I have had this decade, the absolute certainty that I had to act. Sometimes I think back to the moment I heard him on the phone in the garden, to the minutes I stood motionless behind the kitchen door. I could have gone out. I could have confronted him, demanded answers, raised my voice. I did not from fear, but because I knew. Noise resolves nothing lasting. A man of 70 has learned that most conflicts born in shouting end in silence and well-prepared papers. I had the papers. I only needed to wait until Craig gave me the legal reason. He was impatient enough not to keep me waiting long. The house is still here. The apple tree bears fruit every autumn. The workshop smells of wood and oil. Every morning I take my coffee by the window that looks onto the garden, the same window from which I had watched Dorothy gardening for years, in silence, without her knowing I was watching. I have lost in this house more than most people lose in a lifetime, and I have built here more than can be measured in square footage. What Craig never understood is that ownership does not begin in the title deed. It begins in the hands that created something, and in the heart that truly paid. I do not speak much about this time, not because it still hurts. That pain is old and quiet now. I do not speak about it because important things do not need an audience to remain true. But sometimes, when the grandchildren are visiting and the house fills again with voices and footsteps, I think, perhaps that is the real victory. Not the 48 hours, not the document, but that this house is still standing, still sound, still smells as it did before, and that I am still inside it, as on the first day, as Dorothy had always imagined and wished. There are people who say I waited too long. Others say I should never have let things go that far. Perhaps both are partly right. I do not deny it. But I am not someone who acts before being certain, and I am not someone who punishes without concrete and demonstrable cause. Craig gave me that cause himself through his own impatience. The rest I handled without detour, without unnecessary drama. To anyone who asks whether I have forgiven him, I stopped thinking about him. That is more peace than any forgiveness could give me. Patience is not weakness. It is the sharpest form of strength. Now it is your turn. Write to me in the comments. If your own son had called you useless in front of everyone, in the house you built with your own hands and paid for with your own money, what would you have done? Would you have acted sooner than I did, or would you have waited as I did for the exact legal moment? And one question that genuinely interests me: did Craig deserve a second chance? Or were the 48 hours exactly what a man like him needed to finally understand something he should have known from the very first day?